When Undertaker Samuel Morrison refused to bury the body of a prominent cattle rancher in 1887, the people of Dry Creek, Texas, assumed he'd finally lost his mind after 30 years of handling the dead. But when they forced open the coffin Samuel had sealed shut, they discovered that the corpse contained evidence of the most shocking conspiracy in frontier history, and that Samuel had been protecting a secret that could destroy half the town's leading families. Samuel Morrison had arrived in Dry Creek in 1857 as a young man with a solemn disposition and the specialized skills needed to provide frontier communities with dignified funeral services. At 25 years old, Samuel possessed training in embalming techniques that were rare on the frontier, knowledge of carpentry that allowed him to build quality coffins, and the emotional strength required to help grieving families through their darkest hours. Most importantly, he understood that in a place where death came suddenly and often violently, the Undertaker served as more than just a businessman. He was the guardian of the community's deepest sorrows and most carefully guarded secrets. Dry Creek was a cattle town that had grown rapidly during the 1850s as ranchers established operations to supply beef to growing cities throughout Texas and the expanding railroad networks that connected frontier communities to eastern markets. The town of nearly 3,000 residents was dominated by a handful of wealthy cattle barons who controlled vast ranches spanning hundreds of thousands of acres, employed hundreds of cowboys and ranch hands, and wielded political influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of their local community. Samuel's funeral parlor quickly became an essential institution in Dry Creek, serving families from every social and economic level of frontier society. He handled the burials of everyone from prominent cattle barons to immigrant laborers, treating each deceased person with the same professional dignity and attention to detail. Samuel's reputation for discretion was absolute. Families knew that whatever secrets their departed loved ones might have carried to their graves would remain protected by the Undertaker's professional ethics and personal integrity. But over his 30 years of service, Samuel had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the deaths that occurred in and around Dry Creek. While violent death was common on the frontier, Samuel observed that certain types of people seemed to die under suspicious circumstances with unusual frequency. Ranch hands who had been asking questions about their employers' business practices would suffer fatal accidents. Traveling merchants who had been investigating irregularities in cattle sales would be found dead on remote trails. Most troubling of all, government officials who had been sent to investigate reports of illegal activities would mysteriously disappear or die before completing their work. Samuel's concerns deepened when he began to notice that many of these suspicious deaths involved people whose bodies showed signs of violence that didn't match the official explanations for their deaths. Cowboys who had supposedly died in horse accidents bore injuries consistent with beatings. Merchants who had allegedly drowned in river crossings showed evidence of strangulation. Officials who had reportedly died of natural causes displayed symptoms of poisoning that Samuel recognized from his knowledge of embalming chemistry. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Samuel realized that all of these suspicious deaths were connected to the same group of wealthy cattle ranchers who controlled Dry Creek's economy and politics. William Garrett, the most prominent and respected rancher in the region, seemed to be at the center of a network that included Sheriff Tom Bradley, Judge Harold Winston, and several other influential figures who held positions of authority in local government and business. Samuel's discovery of what appeared to be a systematic conspiracy to eliminate people who threatened the interests of Dry Creek's cattle barons presented him with a moral and professional crisis. As an undertaker, Samuel was bound by traditions of discretion and neutrality that prevented him from openly accusing his customers of criminal activities. But as a citizen and human being, he couldn't ignore evidence that suggested innocent people were being murdered to protect the illegal activities of wealthy and powerful men. The solution that Samuel developed was as ingenious as it was dangerous. He began conducting detailed examinations of every suspicious death that came through his funeral parlor, documenting evidence of violence and collecting physical proof that contradicted official explanations. He also started maintaining secret records of conversations he overheard during funeral services, when grief and alcohol loosened tongues and revealed information that people would never have shared under normal circumstances. Samuel's private investigation was aided by his unique position in the community and the special trust that people placed in undertakers. Grieving family members would often confide their suspicions about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths, sharing information they were afraid to report to authorities they suspected might be corrupt. Fellow professionals like doctors and lawyers would sometimes share their own concerns about suspicious deaths, knowing that Samuel could be trusted to keep their confidences. Most importantly, Samuel's work preparing bodies for burial gave him access to physical evidence that would have been impossible for ordinary citizens or even law enforcement officers to obtain. Hidden wounds, concealed injuries, and evidence of poisoning could be detected during the embalming process, allowing Samuel to build a comprehensive picture of the violence that was being disguised as accidents and natural deaths. Over the course of several years, Samuel accumulated overwhelming evidence that William Garrett and his associates were operating a criminal enterprise that included cattle rustling, land fraud, intimidation of witnesses, bribery of officials, and systematic murder of anyone who posed a threat to their operations. The network was sophisticated and well-organized, with connections to corrupt officials in the state capitol and business relationships with criminal organizations throughout the Southwest. Samuel's investigation revealed that Garrett's criminal activities extended far beyond simple cattle rustling. The rancher was involved in a complex scheme that involved stealing cattle from small ranchers, altering brands and ownership documents, selling the stolen livestock through legitimate markets, and using the profits to buy political influence and expand his criminal operations. Anyone who discovered these activities or threatened to expose them was eliminated through methods that were carefully designed to appear accidental or natural. The evidence that Samuel had gathered was stored in a secret compartment beneath his funeral parlor, hidden in a location where it would be safe from discovery by Garrett's associates who Samuel suspected were monitoring his activities. Samuel's plan was to continue collecting evidence until he had enough proof to present to federal authorities who would be beyond the reach of local corruption and who could bring down the entire criminal network. But Samuel's investigation took an unexpected turn in October 1887. When William Garrett himself died under circumstances that immediately aroused Samuel's suspicions. Garrett had reportedly suffered a heart attack while working alone on his ranch. But when his body was brought to Samuel's funeral parlor, the undertaker's examination revealed evidence that suggested a very different cause of death. The autopsy that Samuel conducted in secret revealed that Garrett had been poisoned with a substance that would have caused symptoms resembling a heart attack, but would leave traces that could be detected by someone with Samuel's knowledge of chemistry and anatomy. More disturbing still, Samuel's examination of Garrett's clothing and personal effects revealed hidden compartments containing documents, money, and other evidence that proved the extent of the rancher's criminal activities. Samuel realized that Garrett had been murdered by his own associates, either because he had become a liability to their operations or because he had been planning to betray them to authorities. The killer had assumed that Garrett's body would be buried quickly without detailed examination, allowing the evidence of both the murder and the criminal conspiracy to be buried along with the corpse. Samuel faced the most difficult decision of his career when he discovered that Garrett's clothing contained detailed records of bribes paid to local officials, lists of people who had been murdered to protect the conspiracy, and correspondence with criminal organizations in other states that revealed the true scope of the network's activities. If he allowed Garrett to be buried with this evidence, the conspiracy would continue and more innocent people would die. But if he exposed the evidence, he would be violating the professional ethics that had governed his career and potentially signing his own death warrant. The solution that Samuel chose was characteristically methodical and morally courageous. He decided to preserve Garrett's body and the evidence it contained until he could find a way to safely present his findings to authorities who would be capable of acting on them. This decision required him to refuse to bury Garrett according to the normal schedule, creating a confrontation with the dead man's associates who desperately wanted the evidence buried along with the corpse. Samuel's refusal to proceed with Garrett's burial immediately aroused suspicions among the very people who had the most to fear for what the Undertaker had discovered. Sheriff Bradley and Judge Winston began pressuring Samuel to complete the funeral preparations, claiming that delays were disrespectful to the deceased and distressing to his family. But Samuel remained firm in his refusal, claiming that he needed additional time to properly prepare the body due to the circumstances of Garrett's death. The standoff that developed over the next 3 days created enormous tension throughout Dry Creek as word spread that the town's trusted Undertaker was refusing to bury one of its most prominent citizens. Most residents assumed that Samuel had suffered some kind of breakdown under the stress of handling so many deaths over the years. But a few perceptive individuals began to suspect that something more significant was happening behind the closed doors of the funeral parlor. Samuel used the 3 days to make copies of the most important documents he had found in Garrett's possession and to prepare a comprehensive report that detailed everything he had discovered about the criminal conspiracy. He also sent secret messages to federal authorities in Austin, providing them with enough information to begin their own investigation, while warning them that local law enforcement could not be trusted. The crisis came to a head on the 3rd day when Sheriff Bradley arrived at the funeral parlor with a court order signed by Judge Winston demanding that Samuel immediately release Garrett's body for burial. When Samuel refused to comply, Bradley threatened to arrest him for interfering with the proper disposition of human remains and for violating his professional obligations as a licensed undertaker. Samuel's response was to barricade himself inside the funeral parlor with Garrett's body, declaring that he would not allow the corpse to be buried until proper authorities had examined the evidence it contained. This dramatic action forced the confrontation into the open and attracted the attention of federal investigators who had been traveling to Dry Creek in response to Samuel's earlier communications. The siege of the funeral parlor lasted until federal marshals arrived with warrants for the arrest of Sheriff Bradley, Judge Winston, and several other members of the criminal conspiracy. The evidence that Samuel had preserved in Garrett's clothing, combined with the documentation he had accumulated over years of secret investigation, provided federal authorities with everything they needed to bring down the entire network. The subsequent investigation revealed that William Garrett and his associates had been responsible for over 40 murders spanning a period of more than 20 years. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cattle, defrauded the federal government of land grants and mineral rights, and corrupted local officials throughout several counties. The network's operations had extended into multiple states and had connections to some of the most notorious criminal organizations in the post-Civil War Southwest. The trials that followed Samuel's revelations resulted in convictions for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption that sent more than 30 people to prison and led to the execution of several ringleaders. The evidence that Samuel had preserved also led to the recovery of stolen property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and provided closure to families who had spent years wondering about the true circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. For Samuel Morrison, the exposure of the conspiracy marked both the end of his career as an undertaker and the beginning of his recognition as one of the most important law enforcement figures in Texas history. Federal authorities acknowledged that Samuel's investigation had been more thorough and effective than anything their professional agents had accomplished, and his methods became a model for future investigations into organized crime and political corruption. The people of Dry Creek struggled to comprehend the scope of the conspiracy that had operated in their community for over 2 decades. Many residents realized that deaths they had accepted as tragic accidents or natural causes had actually been murders committed to protect the interests of men they had trusted and respected. The revelation forced the entire community to re-examine their assumptions about authority, respectability, and the true nature of the people who wielded power in their society. Samuel's decision to preserve William Garrett's body and the evidence it contained had required enormous personal courage and professional sacrifice. He had risked his reputation, his livelihood, and his life to ensure that the truth about the conspiracy would be revealed and that justice would be served for the victims of the criminal network. His actions demonstrated that even in the most corrupt and dangerous environments, individuals with moral courage could make a decisive difference in the struggle between justice and lawlessness. The funeral parlor where Samuel had conducted his investigation became a landmark in the history of frontier law enforcement, though Samuel himself never returned to practice as an undertaker after the conspiracy trials concluded. Federal authorities offered him a position as a special investigator, recognizing that his unique combination of professional skills, community connections, and moral courage made him exceptionally well-suited for complex criminal investigations. Samuel's story also had a profound impact on the regulation and professionalization of funeral services throughout the American West. His example demonstrated that undertakers possessed unique opportunities to detect and document evidence of criminal activity, leading to new training programs that taught funeral professionals how to recognize signs of violence and how to properly preserve evidence for law enforcement authorities. The criminal network that Samuel exposed had operated successfully for so long because its members had understood that dead bodies normally took their secrets to the grave, protected by social customs and professional practices that discouraged detailed examination of the deceased. Samuel's willingness to violate these conventions when justice demanded it established new precedents for the responsibilities of professionals who encounter evidence of criminal activity in the course of their work. William Garrett's body was eventually buried in an unmarked grave after serving as evidence in the trials that brought down his criminal associates. The elaborate funeral that had been planned for the supposedly respectable cattle baron was replaced by a simple burial ceremony attended only by federal officials and Samuel Morrison, who finally fulfilled his professional obligation to provide proper disposition for the dead. The documents and evidence that Samuel found hidden in Garrett's clothing revealed not only the scope of the criminal conspiracy, but also the sophisticated methods that the network had used to conceal their activities. They had created false identities, forged government documents, established legitimate businesses as covers for illegal operations, and developed relationships with corrupt officials that allowed them to operate with virtual impunity for years. Perhaps most remarkably, Samuel's investigation revealed that several other members of the conspiracy had also been murdered by their associates when they became liabilities or threatened to expose the network's activities. Their deaths had been disguised as accidents or natural causes, and their bodies had been buried with evidence that could have exposed the conspiracy years earlier if anyone had possessed Samuel's knowledge and courage to examine them properly. The impact of Samuel's revelations extended far beyond the immediate prosecutions and convictions that followed his exposure of the conspiracy. His work led to new federal legislation that strengthened law enforcement authority in territories and frontier regions, established better coordination between local and federal investigators, and created new protections for citizens who reported evidence of organized criminal activity. Samuel Morrison died in 1923 at the age of 91, having spent the final decades of his life working as a special investigator for various federal agencies. His funeral was attended by dozens of law enforcement officials, judges, and politicians who credited his courage and determination with making their own work possible. The inscription on his gravestone reads simply, "He refused to let the dead keep their secrets when justice demanded the truth." The Undertaker, who had seemed to lose his mind when he refused to bury William Garrett, had actually demonstrated the clearest thinking and strongest moral courage of anyone in Dry Creek. His willingness to risk everything to preserve evidence of criminal activity had not only brought justice to the victims of a murderous conspiracy, but it also established new standards for professional responsibility and civic courage that influenced American law enforcement for generations to come. If you're enjoying these incredible, true stories of moral courage and hidden heroism, hit that subscribe button, because we've got many more tales of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things waiting for you. Click on the video on your screen to hear another story about someone who discovered that sometimes the most important evidence is hidden in the places where no one thinks to look, and that true justice requires the courage to challenge even the most respected members of society when the truth demands it.